Um, 23, chapter 23, New Era to Great Depression. Henry Ford's car was the Model T. He sold 25 million of them. Now, this may surprise you. Officially, there are still 1 million Model Ts registered in the United States. The people who own them have kept them up for paint jobs, and some of them look like as good as they did when they were first sold factory. If you go to these car shows, you'll see cars from the 40s and 50s, 30s, and even Model Ts. And some of them have been restored, but my dad owned a Model T one time. Now, he said, my workers will buy my product if they can afford to, so he paid his workers an outlandish $5 a day, which back then was a lot of money. Today it seems like so little. But this was, and by doing so, he had two advantages. Number one, he could pick his workers. And also his workers were less likely to leave because they could never find another job. It was like Lockheed. I mean, when I spent 27 years at Lockheed could pick its workers because they paid more than the other places around did. Lockheed could pick, and also a lot of Lockheed employees would stick with them because they knew they couldn't find. It's like one Lockheed man said, nobody would pay me what I'm making now for doing what I do, which was nothing. That's anyway, yes.
My husband works for Lockheed, and he come and realized the other day that one of the janitors is making more than somebody that has a higher position because he's been with them forever. So he's close to six figures actually a year being a janitor.
They have a two-tier pay scale that they start, and they try to keep that from the Air Force. But you start out making 2/3, and you work your way up at a quarter an hour every quarter. Every 3 months, get a quarter an hour. And they have this two-tier scale, and it takes a year. But some janitors at Lockheed make more money than engineers do.
Yep.
Particularly starting engineers. Yeah, this is very, very, very true. And the pay is very uneven and very, anyway, but this is extremely true. But nevertheless, they still pay more than a lot of other places pay, and they can pick their workers. And Lockheed employees will sometimes get discontent, and they could quit any time. And most of them don't, but believe me, I got out as soon as I could. I had my 85 points in, and the day I got my 85 points in was the same day I carried my family, 3 children, my wife in with me, and I drove them around in an electric car, drove them around the factory in one of their electric cars, and I got out. Never went back in. I mean, I don't regret having worked there, but it was not what I intended to do in my life. This was my dream.
Start to begin with.
Huh?
And why'd you work there to begin with?
Because I couldn't teach anymore. Hey, teachers have problems with called combat fatigue, depression, low self-image, chest pains, sleeplessness. I was suffering from all of that. So the same reason this woman was telling about earlier, took a job as a janitor, sweeping floors and mopping floors at a mall. That's why I went there. I trained myself in electronics. Okay, I trained, and that helped me get in the door. I passed her entry test. I was self-taught in electronics. I mean, I know what a transistor is, and I know what a capacitor is, and a variable capacitor, and a rheostat, and Ohm's law, and that kind of stuff. I trained myself. All right, Model T sold 20 million and paid his workers a really high wage, and this helped him keep his workers. Even though he was a slave driver, he was really, really hard against unions. During this time period, in the 1920s, 1 out of every 4 workers worked in some way in the automobile industry. They either worked at gas stations, or they worked on roads, building roads, or they worked on building bridges, building parking lots. The invention of the automobile called for building hard roads. Cars do not do well on unimproved roads. It has been years since I was on an unimproved road with my car, but when I was a child, my dad would often get stuck driving on a dirt road. Georgia had a few dirt roads when I first moved here 40 years ago. Not anymore. At least I haven't seen one. I mean, all right, maybe private lanes or something are dirt, but I don't know if any public roads in Georgia are still dirt or not. If any of you know of one, try to stay off of it when it rains. I'll advise you. You can get mired up. But anyway, Model T, 1/4 of the workers. Now, catch this close. Henry Ford liked the old ways, even though he was producing a modern machine. He hated Jews, he hated Catholics, he hated bankers, he hated doctors. He hated unions. He was the last of the big automobile companies to recognize a union. He finally did, only because his wife really put the pressure on him to recognize a union and agree to negotiate through a union. Now, the word Ford somehow, somewhere along the way got a reputation for being a cheaply built car, and some people say the word Ford stands for fix or repair daily. All right, leaving that alone, Ford's big contribution was not just paying his workers highly. His number one contribution was the assembly line, where every worker did one job. Most of the time a worker, and it became very, very monotonous. The worker would put a nut on the top of a part and a bolt underneath and tighten the bolt to the nut and pass the part on down. The next person would put another bolt down, pass the part on down. Assembly line, where there actually be several assembly lines. One assembly line would be making the engine, another assembly line might be making the body, another assembly line making the frame, the chassis. Eventually the engine was mated to the frame, then the body was mated to the frame also. Again, we had some assembly lines here in Atlanta. Ford had a plant here in Atlanta. But originally the Ford plant was located in Detroit, Michigan. And for many, many years, Detroit became the number one automaker. Now, the auto industry has been a big industry in the United States. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Just today, it's on MSN, if it's still there, the automobile industry is hurting, owing to the fact that our car companies have produced more cars than they can sell. This is due to two. Number one, they've made their cars so good that people keep them longer. And number two, more and more parents are not teaching their children how to drive these days. Basically, the cars just simply aren't selling for whatever reason. Today's cars are really, really good compared to the cars of yesteryear. I have a car now that's, 4.5 years old and never had to have a bearing replaced, never had a muffler replaced, never had any engine or transmission work done. Nothing more than oil changes and a little bit of brake work. And a few tires, and haven't even replaced the battery on it yet. Again, really, really good today. At one time when I was a kid, we had to replace the muffler every 3 or 4 months. Replace tires about every 3 or 4 months. Car repairs were a constant. I will say this though, car repairs today are expensive. Very much so. And again, that's because they're made better than they once were. And today, robots do a lot of the work of assembly. That's maybe good in some ways, but anyway. More Americans were living in urban areas. The United States was the ideal place to start the automobile industry because the United States was a big country and there are big distances to cover. And automobiles would go places where the trains would not go. On the other hand, the Ku Klux Klan revived. This was done not just because they were afraid of blacks, but the Klan also, what really your book says, and as I think a lot of it's true here, the Klan was upset at the gains women were making. Women had gotten the right to vote, and a lot of people in the Klan were upset. And now, I'll have a little bit more to say about the right to vote. I thought about saying, but I'll have more to say about that later. But the Klan was against Catholics, Jews, foreigners, and what they called uppity women, women who were moving up. Again, you'll find this in the book. By today's standards, they were sexist and they were racist. And of course, the Klan only took men. What attracted a lot of men to the Klan was the feeling of people have that you want to belong to something. You want to join some club, or want to be part of a brotherhood, or whatever. The Klan was to decline when one of its top men raped a young woman, and this brought a big scandal against the Klan. Now, the Klan was to revive again in the 1960s during the racial turmoil that occurred during Lyndon Johnson's term, and this was when I was still a kid in high school. but the Klan revived again. It is still around. All right. Now, Harding. Folk, I've heard two different opinions on this. There was a recession. That's a fact. There was a recession that occurred early in Harding's administration. Now, a lot of persons will say that Harding, being inept, did absolutely nothing about it. And one man wrote a book called The Forgotten Depression. The recession really was bad, really bad, but we forgot it because it lasted so short. It was over with quickly. The author of the book said it was because we had a president who did not do anything about it. The people realized the government is not going to bail us out. We've got to pull ourselves out of this. So they got to work, and in short order, the depression was over. Your book says now about this depression that Harding responded by helping the big businesses. He probably did. This was a Republican way of doing things. And it's called trickle-down economics, which we will talk about later. Trickle-down economics has gotten a really bad name after the Depression of the 30s. In this case, so it appears to have worked. The Depression was over with quickly. So if Harding did anything at all, he helped the big businessman. And this helped end the Depression. All right. Folk, I'll say that, my daughter worked. Does anyone know what the biggest employer in the country is, where the employees work in one campus or in one facility? Does anyone know what the number one employer is?
What, just like private?
Yeah, their biggest private employer. It's Disney World
Oh, yeah.
in Florida.
Yeah.
Now, let me just write this down. Oops. This statement is considered historically accurate, even though I seriously doubt that Walt Disney ever pounded a nail. I can't picture Walt Disney measuring a board and sawing a board to size. And yet, when we say he built them in, this statement is considered correct because of the usage of our language, in almost any language. He did not build anything unless he broke ground at a ceremony where he'd take one shovel and shoveled one shovel full of dirt. He might have done that. But as far as pounding a nail or sawing a board or laying a block or laying a brick or pouring any concrete, I doubt he did any of that. What the point of making this, he hired people by the thousands, see, to draw up the plans, draw the blueprints, landscapers to lay out the landscape. He had to hire people by the thousands, and today he's hiring people by the thousand. Well, he's gone, but his organization hires people by the thousand. Again, the rich folk, the richer the rich get, the richer. Now this is called trickle-down economics. Some people discredit it. I still hold on to it. We'll talk more about that when we come to the Depression. Now, a lot of Harding's friends went to jail. In addition to that, Harding is known to have had affairs with at least 2 women while in the White House, or at least this was not found out about 2 years later. Make a long story short though, Harding went on a trip to Alaska one time, which was then a territory of the United States, so it's not like he left the country. He went on a trip to Alaska. The country was told your president is sick. Then the country was told your president is recovering. He was sick, then recovering. Then the country was told your president is dead. Your book says he died of a heart attack. Again, I had teachers who required us to do outside reading. Some of the old books say that there's a possibility of 2 things. Number 1, he committed suicide. Number 2, his wife might have poisoned him. None of this can be proven, folk. Harding was elected in a 0 year, and all presidents for 140 years who were elected in 0 years died in office. Harding was one of them. The nation gave him a big funeral and a big mourning for him. Calvin Coolidge was at his father's home up in New Hampshire. And one night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, 3 hours in the morning, his father was just of the peace. Now, if you had been a just of the peace in the 1920s and someone knocked on your door at midnight or in the wee hours in the morning, you'd think, yeah, it's some couple wanting to get married real fast. Anyway, the father answered the door, and then the father turned and called, "Calvin, come down here." Calvin, his son, had just become president of the United States. So the father, being just administered the oath of office to his son, Calvin Coolidge, Calvin hurriedly got dressed, went to Washington. He was slow at moving into the White House because Mrs. Harding occupied the White House. When he moved in, he found the White House in shambles, even as Mrs. Johnson did when Lincoln left the White House. A history book in high school said there never was such a change of personalities as a change that occurred when Harding was replaced with Harding, a card player, heavy drinker, was replaced by Coolidge, who never drank, did not like to play cards, a regular churchgoer. Different personalities such as never was. But anyway, Calvin Coolidge became president. He was to be president for 6 years, actually 5.5. He finished out Harding's term, then was reelected. Coolidge was a president of business, unlike the other Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. Coolidge left the big business alone. Pretty much they were allowed more freedom. The country seemed to prosper under this. There was a treaty that occurred in which the navies of the world, a lot of them scrapped a lot of their warships. They agreed to, basically it was disarmament, folk. All right. Here's what went on during Coolidge's time. The country was and the whole world was in a mood that we must never have another war. Pacifism. And they studied war and decided that war is caused when both sides want it. Now, folks, this is not necessarily true. But if one side is just willing to not have war, to make peace, then there'll be peace. No, this is not always true. Now, when I was a young man, my sister determined she was going to watch our parents' arguments. So one day, our parents got into an argument. She watched unfold, and afterwards she got alone and tried to analyze. Now, he said, she said that, what got it started, and she came to an interesting conclusion that they were both wrong, that they were both equally wrong, and if any one of them, him or her, would have simply solved his or her own problems, there would not have been an argument. There is a lot of truth in that, but sometimes, folk, it only takes one side. There's an old saying, it takes two to have a quarrel. No, it doesn't. Sometimes it only takes one, which we found out. Anyway, the world decided we can stop all wars, and they tried to outlaw war. A man named Albert Einstein, a Jew, called for pacifism. He wrote a book, Why War? He wrote several books. The Jewish rabbis were teaching pacifism. Now, I've got to say this. I mean, I know we're in a Jewish community here, and some of you might be Jewish. Jewish rabbis, I've been told today, do not teach pacifism anymore. Why? Because a number of them were thrown into hot ovens, screaming and kicking. And after that, that cured them of their pacifism. I say this because my dad taught pacifism. I don't believe in it anymore. One of my brothers does. He was a conscientious objector who got out of the Vietnam War. I don't believe in that anymore. The best way to have a war, folk, is to make the other side think you're not going to make it. That's what happened in World War II. One side wanted it, and they believed the other side wouldn't make it, so the war started. But anyway, there was a strong pacifist movement. During the 20s, this is sometimes called the Roaring Twenties.
Great Depression.
That comes later. The Depression occurred in the 30s.
Yeah.
But during the Roaring Twenties, people began buying. This was when we started buying on the installment plan. In other words, if you can't afford it now, buy it on credit. Now, the problem with buying on credit is you wind up paying more than you would if you could pay cash outright. But you buy things that are expensive on the installment, like farmers would buy tractors on credit. And farmers would buy their combines and reapers all on credit and pay it in installments. People began buying houses on the installment plan. Make monthly payments as long as you made the payments, they were yours. Buy a car, again on the installment plan. Installment buying began at this time, and it enabled people to get things they otherwise would not get, but oftentimes they bought things they wound up could not afford. Radios became popular, and so popular the radio is about in every home. Those old AM radios, they could tune in shortwave stations, and you could hear stations across the ocean. They have their antenna sticking out, and you could touch the antenna with your hand, and people use their bodies. Now, does anyone in here know what I'm talking about? You do, yeah, those old radio, tube-type radios. They often had a hum to them, a 60-cycle hum, because the filtering wasn't good enough to get hum out. But they had a lot of static. This was because the transmitters in those days were weak, so the radios had to be strong. Now today, the FCC has granted radio stations with about 50,000 watts, 10,000 watts. The stations are strong, the receivers are weak. That way, you don't get as much static on them. Particularly the FM radio is static proof. But the FM radio had not yet been invented. So radios were in widespread use. Movies, the television had not been... Okay, the man who invented television invented it in 1920, but it did not come into widespread use till 1949. But there was a television, but it was not. There were no commercial televisions and no commercial television stations during most of the 1920s. But there were movies. For a dime, if you were a kid, your mother gave you a dime, you could go to the movie and buy a Coke and a bag of popcorn and a movie ticket, all for the dime. For 5 cents, you could buy the ticket. You'd have to do without the popcorn and hot dog and Coke. But I tell my kids, hey, I'll pay for the ticket. I won't pay for anything else. For one thing, theater food is not healthy, number one. Number two, it's expensive. Except for the popcorn now, but everything else is expensive. All right. Now, prohibition, I'll start with that. The 18th Amendment stopped the sale of alcoholic beverages. Persons had worked on it for 80 or so years, trying to get it passed. It was supposed to have stopped crime. Now, your book takes the stance that people drank who had never drunk before, and it increased crime. There's a lot of truth in this, but there are persons who say that actually there was less drinking going on than there had been before, because a lot of people did obey the law. Again, more research might need to be done on this, but as a result of prohibition, bootlegging became popular, and one man who made a lot of money by bootlegging was Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. All right.
No, it's just funny because, yeah.
Okay, now, he was the father of our President John Kennedy. Now, folk, all right, when I was in the 6th grade, my teacher said, this was an election year, with if Kennedy had not yet been elected, said, you ought to know how Kennedy got his money. She would not tell us. So I went to Dad, how did the Kennedy family get their money? He said, bootlegging. I didn't know whether to believe all that, but then it turned out that is largely true. He got his money. He was already fairly wealthy, but he got a lot of his money by bootlegging, illegal, and he could sell the alcohol tax-free because he wasn't supposed to be selling it. Or he would deny that he was doing it, so it was mostly tax-free. Bootlegging. A lot of bootleggers, and again, they'd put their stills deep, deep in the woods and made it hard for federal revenuers to catch them, because they could pick their stills up and move it from one place to another. But they would distill their spirits and sell them on the black market without paying taxes. All right, now, women. Folk, I wish all of you could hear my 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Connolly, female teacher, Mrs. Connolly. She was hard against giving women a right to vote. Here's what she said. She said at one time, the women dressed very modestly and very discreetly. They covered everything except for their faces and their hands. Everything else was covered. Women, you didn't even say they had legs, they had limbs. The word leg wasn't used because it was considered beneath women. When a man met one, he would doff his hat and oftentimes stop and play gentleman a while and then move on. The women were generally courteous to the men, very polite, etc., etc. Then the women got the right to vote. Instead of getting into politics, which they found controlled by men, they began to take off most of their clothes. They bobbed their hair. They started smoking cigarettes and drinking, going to nightclubs, becoming the dance girls called the flappers. And respect for them went downhill fast. Now again, folk, each of you can make up your minds for yourself. I will say this against the old Victorian women. They were all the time suffering from aches and pains constantly. Today's women don't seem to be doing that, but the old time women were just always in some kind of pain. My mother was that way, and I had a friend of mine who said that her mother was that way also. Again, that might be a thing of the past. What caused her aches and pains? Probably mostly it was their imaginations. They felt so inhibited. Again, the respectful went down. A man named Nikola Tesla, a scientist, the best scientist of his day. Nikola Tesla said, "I will not marry because I expected when I was growing up." He grew up before the 18th Amendment. He said, "I expected to marry a female." He said, "Today's women are not females anymore. They'll compete with you. They'll argue with you. They'll fight with you." He said, "I don't want that." So he never married. In his young age, he could have attracted a woman. You see his picture, you know why. In his old age, you see him feeding a bunch of pigeons. It was said he could attract pigeons more than he could attract women. And folk, age does that to everybody. But anyway, he refused to marry because he did not like what he saw in the women. And I will say this, at Lockheed, it is not unheard of for a man at Lockheed, particularly an hourly employee, to refer to his girlfriend as, now quote, "old psycho bitch," unquote, or psycho. This actually goes on. All right.
That's unfortunate.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is. But then again, whose fault is it? The fault of the men or the fault of the women?
Both.
They're very well said. I couldn't agree with you more heartily. A little bit of both. I mean, there aren't very many women sitting in the class right now, but for those of you who are, I mean, hey, I'm for women. I'm married to one. I have 2 daughters, both of them grown. But I don't think giving the right to vote helped them. For one thing, for the next 70 or so years, they either have canceled out the men, they voted evenly, to cancel out the men's vote, or they voted the same percentage as the men. Their vote made no difference. Finally, though, the woman's vote made a difference for 2 men. They voted in Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. You can each decide for yourself whether that was good or not. Before that, I mean, they voted for Eisenhower in the same ratio that the men did. They, like I say, they either split their vote down the middle or they voted in the same proportion as the men did. They voted for Harding, same ratio as the men did. So they basically, for 70 years, their vote made no difference. Eventually, some of them did come into politics. But when they worked at women's jobs such as secretary and teacher. For the first time, they got up the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment supposedly is still up in the air. The Equal Rights Amendment failed to pass. One state, the state of Tennessee, initially voted for it, then rescinded the vote. I think another state did that too. But the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass. But it was up for a vote for, maybe 60 or so years before it finally was largely done away with. It was about this time Margaret Sanger, I've mentioned her before, pushed for birth control and eugenics. Eugenics is killing people to achieve ethnic purity, killing inferior people or sterilizing, not killing outright, but it's